The Austrian army in the Napoleonic age. A conservative empire refusing to die. Inferior in tactics, but with a superior strategy for long-term survival. If we have to name a single main arch-enemy of revolutionary and subsequent Imperial France, it is the Austrians. Austria fought roughly 264 battles, waging 6 wars with the French during this era, and they can clearly be considered the most consistent, tenacious, and oldest enemy of France. Many consider the Austrian army as inferior to the French, and absolutely of lesser quality, even laughing at it, but I think this is not correct. The Austrians had to juggle many issues. Were dealing with an economic downturn and reduction in revenue, struggling to pay for a modern army, while constantly having to maintain their army against all its surrounding enemies. The Prussians in the north, just coming out of the wars with Frederick the Great, an uneasy alliance in the east with the Russians, while constantly at war with the Ottoman Empire, called the hereditary enemy, with Austria being almost solely responsible as the gatekeeper of Christendom in Europe against the Islamic Ottomans. And on top of this, France, even before the revolution, always on the lookout to gain more territory in Italy, the lowlands, and the German territories of the Austrians. The Austrians equally recently incorporated new peoples with different languages, the Poles, the Croats, Italians, leading to even larger logistic headaches. The Austrians had the trouble that they were an empire solely held together by the imperial lineage of the Hapsburgs. Although the German-speaking Austrians from Vienna were the core of Austrian power, the majority of subjects were speaking different languages. As said before, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Italians, just to name a few. To keep all these groups united, the empire made compromises and different regulations with each group about contribution for military service. The only constant was the imperial overlordship of the Hapsburgs, with the different family members or extended Germanic family members leading the various army units to assure unity. This meant German commanders would be leading the units from various nations. The various units were therefore named after their Habsburg-related commanders, with regional connotations. The regular infantry units from regions across the empire were actually of very good standing. With their plain white uniforms and helmets, they looked extremely distinct from other armies. Even modern, lacking the frills and looking relatively plain with short jackets. Units were recognizable by different facings and even button patterns and colors. White silvery for some and yellow and gold for others. In general, these regular infantry were better trained and more disciplined than their French counterparts. While the revolutionary zeal of the French created a common purpose and French identity for its troops, the Austrian troops identified with their region of origin, and strict, harsh discipline assured compliance to the tasks at hand. The German officers were automatically very distant from their men, with the language being a barrier. Orders came from centralized positions, sometimes far away from the front, while the French were able to make local decisions. They marched to the sound of the guns, and they had an energetic emperor moving around to correct overextensions and assure a concentrated force at a single point. It was therefore the command structure that let the Austrian troops down. The superior trained Austrians would stand, but would not stand when enveloped and outgunned at a single point of French concentration. While the draft in France was from across the whole country, in Austria it varied between regions, as a flexible way to assure compliance, meaning the more difficult and powerful groups within Austria, they would gain concessions able to escape military service. However, at least the regular army draftees could be deployed anywhere after they were drafted, and anywhere the army saw fit according to whatever conflict the country was entangled in. Now, next to the regular army units, there were many regions close to borders, especially in the south, bordering the Ottoman Empire, and these people were exempt from being called up on any kind of campaign duty. These were the Grenzer units, on constant alert, guarding the borders of the Austrian Empire. The special position and vital role of national security meant that they were able to have some autonomy in terms of being deployed beyond their own sphere that they defended. Acquiring help from these Grenzers was therefore a question of negotiations. Unfortunately for the Hapsburg, the Grenzers were extremely good and reliable troops due to their high fighting experience. Napoleon during the Marengo campaign highly praised the Grenzer units covering the retreat of the Austrian army here. Equal to the ordinary infantry, the Austrian elite units of the grenadiers or assault troops were considered extremely good troops. They were frequently held in reserve just like the French Guard and used to force a breakthrough or stabilize the front. They would be tenaciously standing in line and not easily give ground. While all good, while all cohesive and very disciplined, they all remained regional units with their own language, with their own traditions, and difficult to bring into a cohesive whole within an Austrian unit. Another aspect that would complicate cohesion among any army unit when called up within a larger command structure was the way they were deployed on campaign. All soldiers, regular infantry, Grenzers or grenadier troops would during campaign frequently be swapped between higher commanders, almost on a daily basis. They regularly received orders to shift and march to different locations compared to the units they billeted with on the previous day of the march. Such shifts created limited understanding among unit commanders of a grand plan, resulting in that they would just follow orders to the letter, marching wherever they were sent, with frequently disastrous consequences when the overall plan would not fit with the local situation at the time. The rigorous discipline of the troops and commanders following orders to the letter without initiative meant that regiments were frequently slow in deployment and reaching locations. The French were known for their fast marches, but this absolutely did not mean that the Austrian troops were less fit or able. On the contrary, the Austrian troops were frequently better trained. It was the logistics of leadership and command that slowed them down. Next to the infantry, the cavalry arm of the Austrians was considered one of the best of Europe, with the Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians having rural people that were born in the saddle, with high familiarity with horses. They were thus considered a standard in terms of cavalry tactics and unit formation for a long time, until the new tactics and cavalry organization of the French would make these old ways outdated and obsolete. An example of how the Austrians used to lead can be seen in British cavalry. For example, what in Britain would later become the famous 1796 pattern light and heavy cavalry sabres. These were just copies of the regular Austrian sabres in service at the time. The Brits followed the Austrians, and in similar fashions were proponents of the cut rather than the thrust, using their swords to hack into their enemy rather than to pierce their enemy with the thrust and speed of the horse. Napoleon always famously used to say that the point always defeated the edge. The hack and cut tactics of the Austrians resulted in a standard heavy butcher blade sword for most Austrian cavalry units. This sword would become the standard British 1796 British heavy cavalry sword. In Austria, the sword was being used by the dragoons, chevaux légers, yes, French names were used, and the cuirassiers. The Austrian cuirassiers only wore a front breastplate of blackened steel, as a back plate was considered cowardice, meaning you had to protect your back in retreat. The Austrian light cavalry of hussars, copied all across Europe, wearing the same kind of uniforms across armies, originated from Hungary, and thus could be considered Austrian Empire cavalry, wielding the curved saber, which would be the basis for the famous British 1796 pattern light cavalry saber. Similar to the Russians, the Austrians would employ many irregular Cossack units, mainly from Ukrainian units, with irregular uniforms and weapons. These were not always reliable on campaign, but masters in harassment and guerrilla tactics. The main weapon of the Cossack was the lance, a thrust weapon with considerable longer reach than the pointed sword. In regular cavalry units, the Austrians confined the use of thrusts to lancers, and these were mainly Polish specialist troops. In the early years, around 1805, the French had not yet incorporated the lancer principle, and would only do so after the Austerlitz campaign, when seeing the Polish lancers and Cossacks at work. The Austrians equally were ahead in terms of artillery. The highly praised French Gribeauval gun system was an adaptation of the Austrian system developed by Joseph Wenzel Liechtenstein. The Gribeauval system improved the gun system, extending range and caliber size. Although artillery suffered the same level of inflexibility of general command structure and inability to deploy quickly, the artillery of the Austrians was generally of equal standard to the French. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars, the Austrians lost the majority of the battles against the French, but in their tenacity they would eventually be on the winning side and provide a major contribution to the defeat of Napoleon. Although not known in history as the side that decisively beat Napoleon, I'm one of those people setting the beginning of the end for Napoleon in 1809 at Esseling and Wagram, where the Austrians showed the way how to hold Napoleon at bay. While Wagram was a marginal French victory, it caused major upset and enormous casualties on the French side. This changed the Napoleonic conflict from a tactical maneuver conflict in which Napoleon seemed undefeatable to an attritional conflict in which France was losing experienced troops at a faster rate than all its coalition partners combined. I therefore lay a large part of the final defeat of Napoleon on the Austrians, who were the first to show single-handedly how 200,000 Austrians could hold 200,000 Frenchmen at bay. This milestone could not be claimed by the English, not by the Russians, not by the Prussians. After the Napoleonic Wars, France changed considerably, while the Austrian Empire held out in various forms until the First World War, going down at the same time as all the other empires: the Ottomans, the Russians, the Prussians, the Germans. France by this time had gone through many changes, from a Bourbon king to a republic, to a Bonaparte emperor again, and then back to a republic. However, before all of this would come to a final conclusion, the cumbersome Austrian war machine would first have to learn its hard lesson in tactics and maneuver as they would meet the Grande Armée of the newly created French Empire for the first time in 1805. But that is a story for another time. Many thanks for watching this video. I do really appreciate it. I hope to hear what you think of my videos, so do please leave comments and suggestions and I will get back to you. I really enjoy making these videos, so giving a like or subscribing will always be helpful. Many thanks and take care.